1862. As the new year dawned in 1862, the Union had failed in its first attempt to capture the Confederate capital at Richmond. Union General George B. McClellan had taken over for the aged General Scott and the disgraced General McDowell, and was slowly and competently building an army outside Washington. He planned to use it in 1862 to take Richmond and crush the rebellion. Meanwhile, the northern blockade against southern ports was slowly growing stronger. Confederate diplomats were in Europe attempting to gain European recognition of their new country, while the United States diplomatic service worked to prevent that. Hundreds of thousands of men on both sides were now training for war, being supplied as well as possible by the two governments. The year 1862 would be by far the bloodiest in all of American history up to that point, and proved once and for all that the war would be a long and bloody affair. Let's start 1862 by looking at the war in the West. And the war in the West is very often kind of forgotten. But one could argue that the most important battles of the entire war took place in the West. And when we say the West, we're talking about the western part of the Confederacy, not California. We're talking about places like Tennessee, Mississippi, the Mississippi River, Louisiana, New Orleans, Missouri is considered to be the western theater of the Civil War. So we're going to, in each of these years, 1862, 3, 4, and 5, start by looking at the war in the West. First, the far west, out beyond the Mississippi River. Troops from the Confederacy attempted to march through Texas, through New Mexico, and remove Union forces from there. At the small Battle of the Glorieta Pass in the spring of 1862, Union troops defeated Confederate troops in northern New Mexico. The Confederates retreated back to Texas, and the western territories in California would safely be in Union hands for the rest of the war. Done. Now, Tennessee. Tennessee is going to be the site of some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire war. It's a border state between North and South. It is a slave state. It's seceded. It is bordered on the west by the Mississippi River, and in its east it pushes up against the Carolinas. So what happens in Tennessee is of vital and supreme importance for the course of the war. In charge of the United States war effort out in the western part of Tennessee, based in Cairo, Illinois, the very southern part of Illinois, is General Ulysses S Grant, a cigar-chomping West Pointer who had failed pretty much at everything in life except the military and his marriage. He had trouble with drinking. He had been reduced to being a clerk in his father-in-law's general store. He had fought with distinction in the Mexican War, but peacetime life did not really suit General Grant, and when the war came, he happily re-volunteered for service. And he, because he had risen in the ranks during the Mexican War, was given an army in western Tennessee and told to take as much of the Mississippi River as he could. And he was a good general. Not a great general, but a very, very good one. And number two, General Grant in early 1862, using a combination of his army and river gunboats, captured the two Confederate forts of Fort Donelson and Fort Henry on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. And thus, General Grant, in his capture of those forts, Donelson and Henry, opened Tennessee and Tennessee and Mississippi to invasion from the north. He also captured 14,000 prisoners. So taking those two forts opened up the rivers that would allow Union troops to invade western Tennessee and northern Mississippi. And the battle that is going to kind of decide the fate of that part of the country is letter C, the Battle of Shiloh. General Grant's force is moving down western Tennessee towards northern Mississippi. He is massing his troops in southwestern Tennessee for a march into the cotton country of the Deep South. To check his advance, the Confederates, under the command of Albert Sidney Johnston, massed an army of 40,000. And now we're going to have to take a look at another battle map, as these two armies okay. General Grant had no idea that there was a Confederate army in the area. His army was massed here, sleeping. One morning, it was early morning. They had not done much in the way of digging in. General Grant believed that the nearest Confederate army was several days' march away. But in reality, General Johnston had brought his army up and had them in this thick woods waiting for the signal to attack. General Grant is all the way back at his headquarters back here. The troops are not ready for the assault of by 40,000 Confederates that is about to come. But come it did. On April the 6th, 1862, 4 divisions of men, 1, 2, 3, 4, smashed into this Union army, these unprepared Union lines. All of a sudden, these Union troops that had been sitting around campfires, waking up in the morning, maybe having breakfast, the still sounds of the morning were pierced by the shriek of the rebel yell as the Confederate troops broke out of the woods and attacked. The Union lines were pushed back very severely. Now, General Johnston did not get what he wanted out of this battle. What General Johnston wanted to do was to have troops come up here first and cut off Union retreat to the river. But that's not how it worked out. That all of his troops attacked at the same time into these Union camps. The word gets back to General Grant, obviously, very quickly. And it was said everyone else was losing their head while General Grant kept his. General Grant works feverishly to bring up reserves. There's another Union army under the command of Don Carlos Buell, kind of up here. He begs them to get themselves to Shiloh as quickly as possible. And Grant works to try to establish a new set of Union lines back by his headquarters. Meanwhile, down at the battlefield on the far Confederate left, on the far Union right, a general by the name of William Tecumseh Sherman is inspiring the Green Union troops to hold their positions and not run away. Riding on his horse constantly among the lines, between the lines, Sherman was nicked twice by bullets, had 3 horses shot out from underneath him as he rode along the lines, urging the Union troops on. But eventually, Sherman's troops were forced to fall back as the Confederates advanced. In the Union center, General Prentiss commanded a Union force at the center of a line along a slightly sunken road. His flanks were collapsing around him, that the Confederate troops were advancing here on their right and advancing here on his left. General Prentiss, with his men in the middle, were in danger of being cut off. He held his ground for several hours, and this land around this road came to be called the Hornet's Nest, as it was incredibly difficult fighting. But General Prentiss held his ground and allowed for Grant's reinforcements to start forming their line. The heaviest fighting of the entire day took place here, in a peach orchard, right behind General Prentiss's line. General Polk pushed General McClellan back there, and this fighting in the peach orchard was vicious, hand-to-hand, back and forth. It got to the point where the horses would not even go across the ground because they were so littered with the bodies of the dead. And what made it so kind of surreal for the troops was the fact that throughout the battle, the cannons and the muskets and the gunfire made all of these beautiful white peach blossoms just slowly fall to the ground as the carnage around them increased. General Prentiss hung on for 3 hours along the sunken road, the Hornet's Nest, and the peach orchard before he was finally forced to surrender. But those 3 hours, he was forced to surrender, so now you have Confederate troops heading up towards the north end, towards Grant's headquarters. But Prentiss did his job very well. He held off the assault, and while his troops were holding off the assault, General Grant brought up more and more reinforcements. Another terrible thing that happened to the Confederacy was the death of General Albert Sidney Johnston. That General Johnston was directing the assault on the peach orchard when he suffered a wound. He did not think it was serious. A surgeon came up to him and said, "General, let's have a look at your wound." General Johnston said, "It's not serious. Go kind of look out for other people." However, he had been hit in an artery in the leg, and before he knew it, his boot was filled with blood. And by the time he realized that, it was too late, and General Johnston bled to death within an hour. He was the only full general to be killed in the course of the entire war. Now, the Confederate attack is not being directed by their traditional commander. General Braxton Bragg in the center kind of took on command, but he was not nearly the same kind of general as General Johnston was. He was not as ambitious, he was not as aggressive, but he ordered his men to attack up near Grant's headquarters. But General Grant's ability to call up reinforcements, General Prentiss's ability to hold the line, General Sherman's ability to retreat in good order had saved the Union Army. General Grant was able to reestablish Union lines, including General Sherman's troops, General McClellan's troops. They all retreated in good order, and back here, along a line of the river, he held his ground. And because they held their ground, the Confederate assault slowed and then petered out. The next day, General Grant turned the tables on the Confederates, and from his position along the river, General Grant counterattacked. And this time it was the Confederates' turn to retreat before a powerful counterattack. By the middle of the second day of the battle, the troops had pretty much returned to exactly where they had been at the beginning. However, the exhaustion of the troops was such that they could go no farther. The Confederates retreated into northern Mississippi in good order, and General Grant held his position and licked the wounds of his army. Such was the Battle of Shiloh. And afterwards, when the cost was counted, something incredible was realized. Take a look at the chart. Take a look at the casualties. The casualties in this single Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862 were greater than all of the military casualties the United States had suffered in battle since colonization began in 1607. That in this one battle, more American troops were killed or wounded or taken prisoner than in all of the conflicts of the United States, the colonial wars, the French and Indian War, the Revolution, the War of 1812, Indian Wars, the Mexican War, combined. The Union had 1,800 killed in action, 8,500 wounded, and nearly 3,000 captured. The Confederacy suffered almost as much, including the irreplaceable General Johnston. And both sides kind of looked around after this battle and kind of sobered up real quick. And it led everybody in both nations to realize that the war would not be determined by a single battle. That this single battle had cost 3,500 dead, 30,000 wounded, and the armies had just pretty much finished up right where they had started. The romantic notions that had characterized the war up to this point were replaced by cold realism, that this was going to take armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands and years of national mobilization. The Confederates realized that they were not going to easily be able to push the Union off of Confederate soil, and the next battles would have to take place in the Confederate States. General Grant's reputation took a big hit. Rumors started to spread that he had been drunk during the battle and unable to direct the course of the fighting. Some of his subordinates, especially General Buell from over here, had started to spread these rumors. Lots of people started to calling for General Grant to be fired. They said, "How could you not have been ready? How could your troops have been caught sleeping when the Confederates attacked?" Lincoln stood by his man saying, "I cannot afford to lose this man. He fights." However, Grant was stripped of his overall command in the West, and General Henry Halleck arrived to take command of U.S. forces. The results of the Battle of Shiloh militarily were important. That General Grant won a victory. He held his own. His army stayed in a position to attack the Deep South and the Cotton States. Thousands of men were killed. But it also had important consequences beyond its military consequences. The idea that the war would be long and bloody and difficult being the most important of them. The next thing that happened in the West happened down in the city of New Orleans. The city of New Orleans, the Crescent City, was the most important port in all of the South, and the avenue by which all of the traffic from the Mississippi River could reach the sea. And all of that cotton that the South counted on trading with Europe, lots of it had to leave through New Orleans. But the South had no navy. The navy was very largely a northern thing, even before the war. And when the war broke out, very few ship captains were Southerners. Very few ship captains chose to take their ships and bring them south. So almost the entire United States Navy, which was a pretty powerful force in the 1850s, much more powerful than the Army, stayed with the Union. And the South had no real navy. They had to build one from scratch, which is not an easy thing to do. One of the Union naval commanders, a man by the name of Admiral David Farragut, was a Southerner who regarded secession as treason. He was the Union officer in charge, tasked with the job of capturing New Orleans for the North. He took his flotilla of ships, as you can see in the picture, ran past the forts guarding New Orleans, and were soon in the city itself, and the city fell without a fight. There was no Confederate army down in New Orleans to contest the capture of the city. It was the first major city of the South to fall to the Union, and as soon as it did in the summer of 1862, no Confederate goods could now be shipped down the Mississippi River and out to sea. It's a major victory in the economic war against the South. But now our attention has to turn back east. And back to our friend, General McClellan, and what he was doing with that enormous army back in the east. And what's going to go on in the east is known as the Peninsula Campaign, letter A. The Peninsula Campaign, because the campaign is going to be focused on the James Peninsula. We're going to focus in on that. Beautiful. Okay. General McClellan in charge. After the disaster of Bull Run, you remember that General McClellan had been put in charge and formed what was going to become the most important Union army of the war, letter A, the Army of the Potomac, named after the river that runs by Washington, D.C. He formed the army and put himself at its head. With the retirement of General Scott, General McClellan was placed in charge of all the Union armies. However, his first of many disagreements with Lincoln over general strategy led the president to remove McClellan from his position as general of all of the armies, leaving him only in command of the Army of the Potomac. And that created some bad blood between Lincoln and McClellan that's going to play a role later on in the war. Lincoln believed McClellan was overly cautious. Lincoln believed that McClellan constantly overestimated the strength of the Confederate forces, and Lincoln was constantly kind of goading General McClellan on. Come on, General McClellan, let's use this massive army that we are building here. What McClellan was good at, letter C, was training the troops. He spent months training the troops. That's McClellan's thing, train the troops. He trained them very well, and the men loved him for it. He took care of them. He made sure they were well supplied. He made sure they were well led. He made sure they were well trained, well taken care of. He was the most popular soldiers general of the entire war in the North. So McClellan starts to think, and he says, how can I attack and take the city of Richmond? And his general, so he finally decides to move. He's done training the troops. He's been training the troops from August to April at this point. And he decides that he is going to use the Union command of the sea to take the troops down the Chesapeake Bay, land them on this James Peninsula, drive on Richmond from the east, and end the war. McClellan finally gets moving in March. He floats his army of 112,000 troops down, lands them at White Horse Station, Virginia, along here on the James Peninsula. He arrives at Yorktown. He arrives outside Yorktown, outnumbering the enemy 80,000 to 10,000. But he believes that the Southerners, behind strong defenses, had many more men than they did. And this is going to be an ongoing theme, a refrain for General McClellan in any of the battles that he fights. He constantly thinks the South has more men than they do. And the South pulls little tricks on him to get him to believe it. They march the same men around and around in a circle, so McClellan counts them all as separate men. They put tree logs, set them up as cannons and paint them black, and from a distance they look like cannon. So although at Yorktown General McClellan outnumbers the Southern General Johnston, another John, not the Albert Sidney Johnston that was killed at Shiloh, obviously. This is Joseph E. Johnston. Although McClellan outnumbers Johnston 8-1, he still hesitates. He spends several days bringing up large numbers of artillery before blasting Yorktown into submission. In doing so, in those couple days' wait, the Confederates from their capital of Richmond brought more reinforcements into the field. But General McClellan does indeed slowly and surely move towards Richmond. He lands at White Horse Station, deals with Yorktown, and then slowly starts to advance up the peninsula, north of the Chickahominy River, south of the York River, towards Richmond. At one point, he's less than 10 miles from the city. And outside of Richmond, at a place called Seven Pines, McClellan attempts battle. McClellan outnumbers the Confederates 100,000 to 60,000 at this Battle of Seven Pines. But McClellan believes there's 100,000 Confederates, so he moves very slowly. At a point on the Chickahominy River, part of McClellan's army got separated from the rest. That part of McClellan's army came south of the river, and the Confederates took a chance. They were attacked from Richmond, this part of the army. They were attacked after crossing the Chickahominy. The battle was a draw, but 10,000 people were killed and wounded, including Confederate General Johnston. Because of this battle here, along the Chickahominy River, and General Johnston being wounded, command of the Confederate Army passed to the Virginian Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was aggressive. Robert E. Lee took the measure of McClellan, looked at McClellan, he knew McClellan, he said McClellan is cautious. The best way to defeat caution is through verve. The best way to deal with a cautious general is to be aggressive and to attack, attack, attack. And Lee is going to attack, 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 even when he does not have a material advantage. This Battle of Seven Pines freaked McClellan out. He still outnumbered the Confederates. He could have continued on to Richmond, but did not. And so, McClellan drew up his troops for a long siege of the Confederate capital. Another thing that shook him was the fact that the Confederate cavalry general, J.E.B. or Jeb Stuart, was kind of riding around his rear, riding around here, cutting him off, riding here, fording the river. Anytime, playing with his supply lines. The fact of General Stuart in his rear always concerned the cautious and careful General McClellan. General Lee, now in charge, takes advantage of McClellan's inability or unwillingness to attack and builds enormous fortifications all around the city of Richmond. General Lee turns Richmond pretty much into an impregnable fortress. From behind these, he's not sitting there though, General Lee. From behind those fortifications, he is preparing a massive counterattack on McClellan's forces aligned against him. General Jackson, while this is all going on, is up in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. General Lee, in order to relieve pressure on Richmond, sent Jackson and his corps on a raid. And the Shenandoah Valley is up that way. When you come out of the Shenandoah Valley, you are on a direct line to Washington, D.C. Jackson and his men wreaked havoc in the Shenandoah, scattering Union troops, capturing Union supplies, thousands of men, thousands of tons of supplies, and forced President Lincoln to take an army of 20,000 that he had promised to McClellan to deal with Jackson in the Shenandoah. That pissed McClellan off, who believed at this point around here that he is outnumbered by the Confederates. He's got about 100,000 men or so. He's actually facing 85,000 rebels, but he thinks there's over 200,000 of them there. And he cannot believe that Lincoln won't give him those men. As soon as President Lincoln ordered men to deal with Jackson in the Shenandoah, Jackson retreats and rejoins Lee around Richmond. He arrived back in Richmond just in time to take part in General Lee's furious counterattack, which became known, number 7, as the 7 Days Battle. Lee's plan was to sweep behind McClellan and cut off the entire Union force. But the plan was a little complex and a little ambitious for an army just getting used to their new commander, and it did not come off as powerful as it intended. However, the attack down here shocked McClellan. McClellan started disengaging his men, retreating back along. See if I can show you this clearly. McClellan tries detaching all of his men, disengaging them, and marching them back towards where they had come from, all the while screaming at Lincoln that he's outnumbered 2-1. Actually, he outnumbers Lee almost 2-1. But he falls back, his lines intact. The last place that the Confederates really have a chance to destroy the Union Army is at a place called Malvern Hill here. That McClellan, in his best moment of the war, extracts all of these men, transfers them across the river, and gets them marching back towards their boats, back towards the Chesapeake Bay here. He never let Lee get around to his rear. He never let Lee destroy his army, but he was forced out of this siege of Richmond, even though he outnumbered the Confederates. By the 4th of July, 1862, after the Union had held off this Confederate attack at Malvern Hill, all of the Union troops were back where they had started. And that meant, for the purposes of this war, a Confederate victory. McClellan had been unable to take Richmond. Months and months of planning and preparation had been for naught. At the cost of thousands upon thousands of casualties, McClellan, going up the peninsula, was unable to destroy the Confederate Army and was unable to take the Confederate capital. Northern morale, which had been pumped up by McClellan's, the troops' love for McClellan and McClellan's confident statements, plummeted. President Lincoln and General Halleck, in command of the Union armies, ordered General McClellan to return to Washington and ordered him to turn his command over to General John Pope, who was forming a new army. So, let's go through our Union generals. Scott, McDowell, McClellan, and now Pope. Southern morale skyrocketed. However, if you look at the costs of the campaign in the table, those costs told General Lee something. Look at the casualties. The Confederacy suffered many more casualties than the Union did during this campaign. Both the Peninsula Campaign and the 7 Days Battle cost the Confederates 40,000 total casualties, 6,700 killed. The South, with its disadvantage in manpower, could not afford those types of casualties. And General Lee knew that. They needed, number one, a knockout blow that would convince the North that the high cost of fighting was too much, and they were better off letting the South go. So General Lee, in his aggressive way, as soon as the Union Army re-embarked and sailed back up to Washington, General Lee started moving north to attack that new army under Pope's command that was forming around Washington. And that leads to letter B, the Second Battle of Bull Run. General Jackson had gone on a wide flanking maneuver towards Washington and approached General Pope's army from the west, threatening General Pope's communication with Washington, with the capital. Pope moved to attack Jackson, which is just what Jackson wanted. Jackson dug in behind an unfinished railroad gauge and held off Pope's attacks while the hammer blow fell on the other side of the field. Lee's troops, moving up from Richmond, came in behind the Union troops. It seemed as if Pope never realized it. Longstreet attacked the Union flank, while Jackson attacked the Union center, and the Union armies crumbled. And if it wasn't for a strong rearguard action, the defeat at Second Bull Run would have turned into the rout that had characterized First Bull Run. That if you look at the casualties of Second Bull Run, they are much more significant for the North. It's another great victory for Lee, the Second Battle of Bull Run, but again, it did not destroy the Union Army. Lincoln took one look at Pope and said, "You're worse than the last guy," and replaced him again with McClellan. Scott, McDowell, McClellan, Pope, McClellan. Saying to criticism, sadly, that we must simply use the tools we have. And this constant change of commanders, this constant inability of the Northern armies to hold their own on the field, convinced Lee even more that the Union was reeling, and all he had to do was win one battle on Northern soil, and he would knock the Union out of the war. And that leads us to one of the most important battles of the entire war, letter C, the Battle of Antietam. So McClellan's back in charge, rebuilding the Union Army. The men were thrilled to have him back. And he starts training the troops, resupplying the troops. The men are thrilled to have him. They believe him when they said that at the Peninsula Campaign they were outnumbered. They thought that Lincoln had done a terrible job in firing him in the first place. But now General McClellan is aware that General Lee is on the move. General Lee's only got 55,000 men, while the Union and McClellan have 90,000. But Lee boldly, he knew McClellan was not going to be bold and attack him, at first sight. So Lee, this was Lee's genius. Lee could get inside the head of all the Union generals and kind of take advantage of their individual weaknesses. And McClellan's weakness was his caution. So Lee knew that he could do things and McClellan would never react quickly to them. So Lee divided his army. General Jackson moves and captures Harper's Ferry, while General Longstreet moved all the way up into Hagerstown near the Pennsylvania border. McClellan finally starts moving his army to intercept these forces, which are panicking the North. Now, but again, McClellan thinks he's going up against twice as many troops as he actually is. McClellan's got 90,000. Lee's got 55,000, but McClellan believes that Lee has 120,000. So McClellan moved slowly and cautiously. And then we get one of those strange things that the fortunes of countries and the fortunes of war often turn on. That's number 3, the lost orders. On the morning of September 13th, 1862, an Indiana volunteer was walking in a camp that had recently been occupied by the Confederate Army on their way north into Maryland. He came up, he saw something in the grass. He picked it up. It was an envelope. Wrapped around, it was a bunch of papers wrapped around 3 cigars. And he kind of said, "Ooh, look, cigars." And he unwrapped them from the 3 papers that were around them, and it turned out that those papers were the exact detailed plans that General Lee had given to his other generals to invade and attack the North. It was known as General Order 191. It had been stuck in a courier's pocket, and when the courier rode off to deliver them, they fell out. Now McClellan had Lee's exact plan. He saw how his army was divided. And people said, if McClellan moves quickly, he can destroy one part of Lee's army and then turn and destroy the other part of Lee's army and then go and take Richmond whenever he wants. But McClellan again waits 18 hours until he orders his troops to move and concentrate on the Maryland town of Sharpsburg. Lee realizes through his cavalry commander, the great horseman, General Stuart, that the Federals were concentrating, and Lee scrambles to reconcentrate his forces. He knows that he knows he's outnumbered almost 2 to 1. He knows that if McClellan can attack one part of his army and then the other, he'll lose. So Lee looks for a defensive place to hold off General McClellan, and if he can manage to hold off General McClellan and destroy the Union Army in the North, then he could win the war. Let's see how this one worked. Okay. Lee has 40,000 men, and they take up a position right around a little part of what's known as Antietam Creek, right here. He has General Jackson with him and General Longstreet with him. 40,000 men only, just outside the city of Sharpsburg, Maryland. McClellan arranges his army in an arc around Lee's forces. On that first night, Lee only had 18,000 men in position. McClellan had 60,000. If McClellan had just attacked that first night, there was almost no way the South could have defended it. But McClellan thought that Lee had 100,000 more in the town of Sharpsville and held off on the attack until the next morning, when he could bring more of his troops up. Lee, for his part, spent the night bringing as many troops as he could into position. The next morning dawned, the 17th of September, 1862, with McClellan's three main parts of his army arranged around Antietam Creek. The entire battle, as we're going to see, is marked by McClellan's utter inability to take all of his forces and use them to attack at once in order to overwhelm the Southern forces under General Lee. Poor communication, however, meant he's got three corps that he wants to use to attack. All right, let's have a look at them. In the north is a Union corps, about 30,000 men, under General Hooker. In the center, another 30,000 men under General Sumner. And in the south, another about 20,000 men under General Burnside. McClellan wants all three corps to attack at the same time. But due to poor communication, the three corps attacked one at a time. And because they attacked one at a time, Lee could move soldiers around at any time to face off against the latest Union attack. As dawn broke, McClellan gave the order for General Hooker in the north to advance. General Hooker's men, under Generals Doubleday, Ricketts, and Meade, came out of the woods and attacked. Their goal was this little church, the Dunker Church. It was a group of pacifists, of all things. That was where they were aiming. But to get there, they had to cross this ground here, which was covered by a farmer's cornfield. In the woods between the church and in the space between the church and the woods was a cornfield where the armies met. For 3 hours, Hooker's men took on Jackson's men in the corn, with artillery from both sides bursting overhead constantly. Throughout the course of the morning, with attack and counterattack in the cornfield changed hands 15 times. The Union would take it, a Confederate counterattack would throw them out. The Union would counterattack and throw the Confederates out. Another time, General Jackson's men would attack. It was perhaps the bloodiest fighting of the entire war. Jackson's outnumbered line teetered on the brink of collapse for the 15th time, but Confederate reinforcements arrived in time and helped him hold the line. Hooker's reinforcements were inexperienced, and their commanders were inexperienced, and they were not effective at conquering this cornfield and taking it for the Union. The Union attack went off around 6 in the morning. By 10 o'clock in the morning, 4 hours later, letter number 3, the Union objectives were not met, and the cost was 13,000 casualties. Pretty much just in that cornfield. 13,000 casualties, if you can imagine that. In the middle of the Union line, General Sumner was supposed to go off and attack at daybreak, but he did not. And he did not attack until word came to him of the awful fighting in the cornfield. So as soon as Sumner heard that this awful fighting was happening in the cornfield, he attacked. He attacked General Longstreet's men. General Longstreet was a very good general, especially in defense. And General Longstreet's men had dug themselves in a good position, in a sunken road. And here's that sunken road, kind of on 2 angles. And you can see from the picture that the men could kind of crouch and fire over the top, while they were protected from Union return fire. And for an hour or two, these Union regiments under General Sumner attacked this sunken road, which came to be known as Bloody Lane, with no success. Finally, though, 2 divisions of Sumner's kind of got around the side of Longstreet's men, and Longstreet's lines began to crack. Where'd my red pen go? Meep. Be right back. Longstreet's line begins to fall back towards Sharpsville. Confederate orders were misunderstood. A Confederate order to wheel and face the fire was misinterpreted as an order to retreat, and the Confederate center began retreating back to Sharpsburg. If Sumner's men could reach the town, they would split the Confederate army and then could destroy it one piece at a time. General Longstreet in town desperately fires artillery to slow down the Union advance. But if you see up here, General McClellan has a whole corps, 30,000 men in reserve. If General McClellan had just moved that corps, Franklin's corps, if he had followed up that attack by Sumner, he could have won the war and won the battle that very day. But number 2, General McClellan hesitated. He believed that most of Lee's army was not in the field. He believed that Lee had 50,000 more men here in Sharpsburg and refused to commit his reserves. In fact, Lee had 0 reserves, literally 0. He did not have one single extra soldier to commit to the fight. The Union had nearly broken the Confederate line, but the success was not followed up. And by noon, both Hooker's corps, exhausted after the cornfield, and Sumner's corps, exhausted after the Bloody Lane and the sunken road and almost cracking the Confederate line, kind of sat in their places. So the fighting moved to the south, and General Ambrose Burnside, down here in the south, he was supposed to attack when Sumner attacked, but did not. And he waited to get specific orders from McClellan to go and attack. And he was supposed to attack across the river. His goal was to attack across the river and come up and attack the Confederate forces from the rear. Now, we have to give a little credit here. Burnside did face a difficult task. He outnumbered his Confederate opponent 4-1, but he was ordered to cross Antietam Creek, where there was only one single bridge. He had to somehow get his men across that bridge, up a slope, and then he could attack and destroy the Confederate army. The bridge, however, was a target for Confederate sharpshooters, Confederate artillery. So you got to give Burnside, you have to recognize that Burnside faced a difficult task. But you could also blame Burnside for not effectively doing some reconnaissance. Because if Burnside had done some reconnaissance, he would have found that there was a place that you could walk across the river about 4 miles south. It would have taken about an hour to march down there and an hour to march back up. But Burnside didn't do that. So Burnside focused all of his energies on crossing this bridge. For several hours, 900 Confederates keep 10,000 Union troops from crossing this bridge. Thousands fell, victim of Confederate sharpshooters and artillery. Finally, McClellan, screaming at Burnside, "Attack, attack, attack!" Units from the 51st New York and the 51st Pennsylvania stormed across the bridge, and the rebels, by now almost out of ammunition, fell back. So now you finally do have Union troops moving in behind the Confederate lines. However, by then, fighting here and here had calmed down enough for Lee to start to transfer some of his troops south. McClellan's got a whole nother corps, Porter's Corps, here that has not been in the fighting. If Porter had been ordered across Burnside's bridge to support Burnside's attack in the south, the battle could have been won on this day. Burnside's across the bridge, waiting to attack, ready to attack, and then somebody realized, oops, no one brought ammunition across. Burnside's men now don't have enough ammunition to follow up their attack. Porter's men are being held in reserve because McClellan still thinks there's thousands of Confederate troops in the city of Sharpsburg. By the time the ammunition comes across the bridge, an entirely new Confederate army under General A.P. Hill has reached the battlefield and has set themselves up in a defensive line in front of Burnside's men. General Hill's troops attack General Burnside's men, who retreat back across the bridge they had fought so hard to cross. Burnside is unnerved by the counterattack. He gives the order for all of his troops to recross the bridge and take up defensive positions on the other side. And that is where they found themselves when night fell. Let's just start with the most basic of aftermaths, the casualties. As you can probably imagine from a description of the battle, the casualties at the Battle of Antietam were immense. In fact, the 17th of September, 1862, is the single bloodiest day in all of American history. It is the bloodiest single day in all of American history. Over 3,600 men are killed violently. Over 22,000 men are wounded. As the day broke, the next day, the 18th, what you are looking at is an exhausted, at the end of their rope, Confederate army, with an exhausted, end of their rope Union army, but a Union army with two entire corps that have not been involved in the fighting. All McClellan has to do is engage these two corps, and there is no way General Lee can defend himself. Lee, by this point, is desperate to get back to Virginia. He's outnumbered more than 2-to-1. His men are utterly exhausted and utterly spent. However, again, he read McClellan like a book. Instead of starting to retreat immediately, Lee puts on a show of force, puts on a show of strength, and makes McClellan think he has thousands of more men than he really does. It is only very slowly that Lee starts to move back into Virginia. All the while, McClellan refusing to attack him. Lincoln and the War Department #1 are begging McClellan to attack, but McClellan does not move. This is prime campaign season. It's not too hot. It's before the snow. There's not much rain. This is the time to move an army. Lincoln cannot understand why McClellan will not attack. Lincoln actually considers taking command of the armies personally in the field, but he is dissuaded from doing that. 6 weeks go by without McClellan moving an inch. He calls for reinforcements. He says there's a lot more Confederates than there really are. Lincoln comes to visit him. McClellan will not move. By November, Lee had gotten completely away, returned to the safety of the defenses around Richmond, Virginia. Lincoln could not understand why McClellan did not move, was angry at McClellan's inability to use the entire strength of the Union Army, was angry and had had enough with General McClellan's personal insults. So for the second and final time, Lincoln removes McClellan from command and replaces him with General Burnside to command the Army of the Potomac. Burnside, for his part, protested that he was not a good enough general to command the whole army, but Lincoln told him he was the best that he had. Overall, General Lee holds the field. He wins a tactical victory. Against overwhelming odds, he did not have his army destroyed. So on a tactical level, Lee wins the battle. But it has to be seen as a strategic loss for the South. Why? Because the South had tried to invade the North, to deliver that knockout blow, and they had failed in doing so. And the Union Army was not destroyed. In fact, it was the Confederate Army that was seriously weakened. Lee had to leave the field. Lee left the field in the possession of the enemy. But although it is not the great victory that Lincoln is looking for, it's a lot better than the losses that had been piling up. First Bull Run, Peninsula Campaign, Second Bull Run. So Lincoln sees this as an opportunity. He's been waiting for a victory to allow him to fundamentally change the nature of the war. So after the battle, literally a week after the battle, on the 22nd of September, 1862, while the northern newspapers were celebrating and yelling and screaming about the great victory, about how Lee's invasion had been blunted, about how Lee's invasion had been stopped dead in its tracks, on the 22nd of September, Lincoln published the Emancipation Proclamation. And that Emancipation Proclamation freed all the slaves in areas under rebellion. We're going to talk a lot more about the Emancipation Proclamation later in the block. But Lincoln uses the Battle of Antietam to publish the Emancipation Proclamation because he does not want it to be seen as a desperation move. He is waiting for a Union victory, and Antietam is enough of a victory for Lincoln to publish that Emancipation Proclamation. The war had been changed. The war had been changed from a war to save the war had moved from a war to save the Union to a war to free the slaves. But as 1862 moved towards the winter, the Union armies were as far as they had ever been from taking Richmond, and although they had blunted Lee's invasion of the North, it was clear that the Army, now under the command of Burnside, had a lot of resupplying, retraining, and remanning to do in order to be ready for Burnside's attempt to take Richmond, which would actually take place late in 1862, before 1863 actually dawned. So that's the results of the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history. The last thing we have to talk about concerning 1862 was the Naval War. And let's start with letter A, the blockade. Throughout 1862, the United States Navy continued to increase the pressure on southern ports and enforce the blockade. As we saw, they had captured the city of New Orleans. Union naval forces and Marines also captured Norfolk, Virginia, another important port. However, by 1862, the Union Navy was not big enough to cover every single southern port. Lots of cotton was shipped out, and more importantly, war material was smuggled in. And now we have to talk about the famous case of the Monitor versus the Merrimack. Back in the early part of the year, before McClellan brought his army onto the James Peninsula, a small naval battle took place that made every single navy on the planet obsolete, old-fashioned, behind the times. At Hampton Roads, Virginia, the Union fleet lay at anchor, preventing the Confederates from accessing the sea. From the southern point of view, those Union ships were preventing the export of the cotton that the South needed to survive, as well as preventing the importing of necessary war goods. And so they thought and they thought and they planned on a way to break the blockade. On the morning of the 8th of March, 1862, then, the Union sailors on their ships awoke to a very strange sight. Steaming up the river was the CSS, the Confederate States ship, Virginia. She had been created from the remnants of the USS Merrimack, an old American ship, but had been covered from stem to stern, from front to back. She had been covered in iron plate, and a ram had been attached to her front. As she slowly steamed up the river at about 5 miles an hour, the Union ships opened fire with all the cannons that they had. But these cannonballs, launched with great power, simply bounced off the sides, bounced off the iron sides of this ship, barely making a dent. And as the Virginia or the Merrimack sailed up and opened fire herself, the wooden ships of the Union scattered. Virginia sank 2, 1 ran aground. The Virginia retired for the night back to her base, preparing to come back the next morning. It seemed as if the Union blockade was doomed, that the Union Navy was scrambling to raise anchor and get up sail, and it seemed that this strange metal monster would break the blockade and open up southern trade to the world. However, the Union has a trick up their own sleeve. The next morning, when the Virginia sailed into the harbor to finish off the Union fleet, she found the USS Minnesota, the ship that had been forced aground, guarded by a small, strange-looking ship best described as a cheese box on a raft. It was USS Monitor, the brainchild of an inventor by the name of John Erickson. And John Erickson had started his design on this strange little ship the moment he had learned that the Confederates were building an ironclad ship themselves. She was a much more revolutionary ship than the Virginia was. She had a rotating turret. Her guns could turn in a circle. She was a low seaboard, meaning that she rode very, very low in the water. She was virtually impossible to hit with cannon fire and could fire in any direction. And these two ironclad ships, the much larger Virginia and the low and slow Monitor, started blasting away at each other all morning. For 3 hours, these two ironclads blasted away at each other to very little effect. It was the first naval battle in history between two ironclads. By the end of this 3-hour and if you would only imagine being in these ships as these cannonballs are bouncing off her iron sides, one of the Monitor's guns jammed. Virginia ran out of cannonballs. They both kind of retired to their respective sides. But the world had changed. Every single navy in the world, from Britain's most powerful navy on earth to every navy, was all of a sudden obsolete. That ironclad ships could sink any wooden ship that could be put out there without being able to be sank in return. The North now, with its industrial superiority, started building Monitors up and down the east coast of the United States to protect its fleet. the South never built another ironclad ship again. Virginia never again left her base. She never again fired her guns in anger. This attempt by the South to break the blockade using wooden ships was doomed because of John Ericsson's invention of the Monitor, and then the North's ability to take the Monitor and make 40 of them. And that's just what the Union did. And although the battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack changed the history of naval warfare, it did not change the fact of the Union blockade. And the Union blockade, as 1862 drew to a close, drew tighter and tighter on the South. 1863 will dawn with the country growing weary of war, growing weary of lengthy casualty lists, but with the Union Army as far from Richmond as ever, and with Southern morale still tenaciously hanging on. We'll see you in 1863.